When a group of progressive television hosts publicly ridicule Hollywood icon Clint Eastwood, they never anticipate backlash from an unexpected source: Barron Trump. Furious over their disrespect, Barron takes legal action, sending shockwaves through the media. The lawsuit ignites a heated debate. Should celebrities be held accountable for their words? As the case unfolds, secrets surface, reputations hang in the balance, and the outcome leaves everyone stunned. The bright studio lights glared down on the sleek, modern set. Millions were tuning in. This wasn't just another interview. It was history in the making. Clint Eastwood, a Hollywood legend, sat across from television host Rick Calloway, a sharp-tongued progressive known for ambushing conservative guests. But tonight was different. Tonight, Clint wasn't here to be ambushed, was here to make a statement. Rick smirked. Clint, with all due respect, don't you think America has changed? Some of your views seem outdated. A tense silence fell over the studio. The audience held their breath. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Clint leaned forward, his piercing gaze locking onto Rick. Outdated? He repeated, his voice slow and deliberate. Rick, let me tell you something. Truth doesn't have an expiration date. The host chuckled nervously. Come on, Clint. You can't deny that younger generations see things differently. Clint's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of decades pressing on his shoulders, decades of watching his beloved country shift into something he barely recognized. And tonight, he wasn't holding back. Then, he said something that made the entire audience gasp. The studio fell silent. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, as if afraid to capture what would come next. Clint leaned back, folding his arms. You know what, Rick? I've lived through wars, seen men die for this country, and you sit here in your expensive suit, telling me that standing for freedom is outdated? Let me tell you something. You don't know what real sacrifice is. Rick blinked. He hadn't expected this. Clint, I just mean. The legend cut him off. No, let me tell you what you mean. You mean people like me should sit down, shut up, and let folks like you rewrite history. But that's not happening. Not on my watch. The audience erupted in applause. Even some crew members who had been warned to stay neutral couldn't help but nod. Rick swallowed hard. He tried to regain control. But times are different now. Young people. Clint's voice softened, but his eyes were sharp. You mean kids like Barron? The mention of Barron Trump sent a ripple through the crowd. No one had expected Clint to bring him up. Rick hesitated. Well, Clint pressed on. That boy has more class, more backbone than most grown men I know. And you know why? Because he was raised right. Something a lot of folks seem to have forgotten how to do. Rick was speechless. For the first time in his career, he didn't know what to say. Rick shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This wasn't going as planned. Clint was too sharp, too experienced. But more than that, he was right. Clint sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. You see, Rick, I know what this country used to be. I remember when a handshake meant something, when a man's word was his bond. But now people are more afraid of offending someone than standing for what's right. The audience hung onto every word. Clint's voice grew softer. I remember a young soldier I met once back in the 50s. He was barely 19, had his whole life ahead of him, but he never made it home. You know what his last words to me were? Rick swallowed hard. What? Clint's eyes glistened for just a second. He said, I just hope it was worth it. The room went still. Clint shook his head. That kid gave his life believing in this country. And now, we've got people who can't even stand for the anthem. A tear rolled down a woman's cheek in the audience. Even Rick looked shaken. Clint looked right into the camera. America needs to remember who she is, because if we don't, we'll lose her forever. The audience stood, applause thundering through the studio. Rick Calloway, for the first time in his life, had nothing to say. The applause had barely died down when Rick finally found his voice. His face was tight, his composure cracked. He had never been outmatched like this on his own show. He forced a smirk. Clint, you're painting a picture of the past that doesn't match reality. America has moved forward. Clint didn't blink. Forward? He leaned in, his voice like steel. You mean where families are broken, kids don't know right from wrong, and people are afraid to speak the truth? Rick scoffed. That's an exaggeration. Clint exhaled. Is it, you ever met a young soldier coming home from war with no legs? Rick hesitated. I have. He looked me in the eye and asked if people back home still cared. You think he felt like we moved forward? The audience was dead silent. Rick hesitated. He knew he was losing control. Clint, America is still great. Then why do so many people feel lost? Clint cut in, his voice thick with emotion. Why do our young men feel abandoned? Why do families struggle while elites tell them everything is fine? Rick had no answer. Tears welled in a woman's eyes. For the first time, the audience saw the cracks in Rick's carefully rehearsed arguments. Rick shifted uncomfortably. You're acting like the country is falling apart. But Clint, things aren't that bad. Clint's jaw tightened. Tell that to the father who lost his son in a senseless war. Tell that to the kid who never met his dad because he was sent to fight for a country that forgot him. A lump formed in Rick's throat. This wasn't how the interview was supposed to go. Clint took a deep breath. I remember a young man I met years ago. He was just a boy when his dad left to serve. He grew up waiting by the door, hoping one day his father would walk through it. But that door never opened. The room felt smaller. Clint's voice cracked slightly. That boy grew up strong. He didn't complain. He just kept going. And do you know who that boy is, Rick? Rick swallowed hard. Who? Clint's eyes locked onto him. Barron Trump. Gasps rippled through the audience. Rick looked shaken. You're saying... I'm saying that boy carries more weight on his shoulders than most men do in a lifetime. And he does it with dignity. Rick had nothing to say. The audience was in tears. The cameras zoomed in on Clint's face. He wasn't just talking, was feeling every word. Barron never asked for an easy life, Clint continued, his voice deep with emotion. He was thrown into the spotlight as a kid. He never complained, never lashed out. And you want to talk about privilege? That boy has lived under a microscope since he could walk. Rick looked stunned. He had never thought of it that way. Clint leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Tell me, Rick, how many kids could endure what he has and still walk with their heads held high? Rick tried to speak, but his throat was dry. Clint shook his head. Barron stands tall because he had a father who taught him what it means to be strong. And yet, people mock him, tear him down. Why? Because he refuses to play the victim. A woman in the audience wiped her eyes. Clint's voice hardened. America used to admire strength. Now we punish it. And you wonder why young men feel lost. Rick lowered his gaze. The audience sat frozen. And then, one by one, they stood. The applause was deafening. Rick sat in stunned silence. Clint Eastwood had just changed the conversation forever.